All right, guys, if there's one question that probably drives every single airline pilot nuts, it is drum roll, please. What routes do you fly? It depends. Sometimes I fly multiple routes a day. Sometimes I don't fly any routes and still get paid. So it really just kind of depends. What I will talk about in this video is how we get our schedules, how we bid for them, and then how we kind of manipulate our schedules once we get them, as well as what it means to be a line holding pilot versus a reserve pilot. All right, here we go. All right, so first things first. As airline pilots, we don't know our future schedules until probably middle of the month prior. At least at my airline, my seat, my base, I don't know my schedule until the evening of the 15th, pretty much every single month. So it's kind of very hard to plan accordingly. So when your airline pilot friends brush you off and say they're not sure if they can make it, they're probably being truthful. So there are two ways to bid for your schedule. One is what's called via PBS, which stands for Preferential Bidding System, and one is line bidding. Essentially what line bidding is all of the schedules. Let's say you have 500 pilots in a base, you have 500 different schedules. They throw them out there and everybody looks at them. They look at the layovers, the days off, and they bid for them. So if I look at it and say, hey, line number 10 looks awesome, I want that as my number one choice, I put that as number one. Or line 100 looks great, I'll put that as line number two, so on and so forth. And then once the bid closes, it looks at what everybody bid and it kind of spits out your schedule based on your seniority. Obviously, the number one guy is going to get their number one choice, and then so on and so forth. It just does it all via seniority. I'm not really a big fan of line bidding. I think it takes a little bit of time to look through all of those lines and sort them out. Some people like them. I much prefer PBS, Preferential Bidding System, which I'll talk about here. And I've done both for a long time, and I think PBS personally is a better way of doing it. And again, whether you're line bidding or bidding via PBS, it's the airline's work rules that usually the union and management negotiated that's really going to make your schedule good or bad. PBS and line bidding, that's just kind of how you get your schedule or how you bid for your schedule. It has no real implication based on your quality of life. That's all work rule related. All right, so and now PBS, it's Preferential Bidding System. Again, it's also done via seniority, but you could be really, really detailed in what you want. Now, there is a stipulation with that. It could backfire, much like my October schedule did. I'll talk about that in a second. But again, PBS, done via seniority. All of the pairings, so to speak, which are all the individual trips, those are our. When I talk about pairings, here's a good example. 3-day trip starts in Newark late in the afternoon. You go to Denver, Denver to Nashville. Also, if you look at that Newark to Denver leg, off to the right, there's that blue circle. That's a meal service where you click on that and kind of pick a first-class meal, which is really, really nice. But anyway, you overnight in Nashville, and then day 2, you go back to Newark, and then to Dallas, overnight in Dallas. Then day 3, just one and done. Late report, go to Newark, and you end up landing at 11:45, and you call it a day. Built, and they kind of put them all in a massive pot, and then the number one senior guy or girl will say, hey, I want this, this, and this, to the all the way down to number 400, and it kind of spits it out via seniority. And you could be very, very detailed. You could say, hey, I want this specific trip on this specific day. Now, of course, you've got to be really, really senior to get that. Or you could do what I do, and I say, hey, I want Thanksgiving off, I want the day before Thanksgiving off, and I want the day after Thanksgiving off. So I want those 3 days. Those are my highest priority. And then I'll kind of relax everything else. So I'll say, hey, you must give me the day before Thanksgiving, and the day after Thanksgiving off. Now, I prefer 1-day trips, 2-day trips, doesn't really matter. And within those, you could say, hey, I want trips that only credit 6 hours and above, or I want a trip that starts with a deadhead where you sit in the back in first class to the Caribbean, and then you fly back and it credits like 8.5 hours. I'm not anywhere near senior enough to get that. But keep in mind, those trips are great, and they go very senior because let's say the company says, hey, we need most pilots to fly between 75 hours and 75 and 80 hours a month. Well, if you're doing those 8.5-hour day trips, you only need to do a couple of those for the month to get up to, let's say, 75 hours. Where me, I'm junior, but I want day trips. I get stuck with, let's say, Myrtle Beach turns from Newark to Myrtle Beach and back. I'm only getting paid 5 hours and 15 minutes. So I've got to do a lot more of those to touch that credit window of, let's say, 75 hours. Now, again, each person has got their own preference. I like day trips in 2 days, and within those, you could say, hey, I want to show or I want to report to Newark no earlier than 6 o'clock a.m., but I don't want to report any later than 9 a.m. either. So you could put that in there and it'll find trips, and based on your seniority, it'll give it to you if you can. You could say, I want overnights in Nashville. I want overnights in Aruba, Cancun. I want layovers that are over 15 hours. So you could really, really get into the weeds. And again, the more preferences you want, the more restrictive it could be if you're not senior. People that commute into Newark, let's say they live in Florida and they commute, they'll probably want 4-day trips that start later in the afternoon and end early, and are probably not too picky with what type of layovers. If they've, if them laying over in Columbus, Ohio means that they can commute in on day 1 and commute home on day 4, that's probably okay with them, so they can go home and see their family. They don't really care so much about the overnight. If you're young and single, you may not care so much, and you might want a nice long overnight in Vegas or somewhere in the Caribbean. It just kind of depends what you're looking for. But PBS is great because, again, you can really kind of fine-tune what you want. If you're super senior, you're going to get all the good trips, and you probably won't have to manipulate them all that much. But for me, somewhere in my seniority, I'm like 68-ish%, somewhere around there. All the magic happens kind of after I get my schedule. So for the month of November, I had 20 bid groups. My number one bid group was, hey, I want Halloween off, I want the weekend of the 15th off, and I want the day before Thanksgiving off, and the day after Thanksgiving off. That was my number one bid group. And then I put in some preferences. I prefer 1 and 2 day trips, but it's not a deal breaker. My bid group 2, so if it can't honor bid group 1, it'll say, okay, I can't honor that. Let's go to bid group 2. I'll say, you know what? I'm willing to work Halloween, but I still want those days over Thanksgiving off. And you kind of just layer your trips like that to the most restrictive dream schedule as bid group number 1, and then kind of relax everything as you go down. The mistake that I made for the month of October was I said, hey, award me trips Monday through Friday, 1 and 2 day trips. And I awarded it in a way that said, hey, you have to give me this. And it couldn't give me that because of my seniority, so I ended up getting reserve over the weekend. It was not good. But the point is, you have to really kind of understand how the software works. You could be really senior, but if you don't know how to bid properly, there's always that chance that you could kind of mess up and get a really, really bad schedule, and you'll have to burn all of your sick time for that month. I'm just kidding. But really, the thing with line bidding is you see all of the lines. So hey, if there's 10 available lines or 20 available lines and you bid 20 of them, you kind of have an idea of what you could possibly get. With PBS, it could always be potentially a lot worse than you think. So you have to really understand how the software works. And again, you could get into the weeds between not only, I want this type of trip, but you can give it certain priorities. Like we have, H neutral and then H plus, H plus plus. So it's just, you really have to kind of understand how the system works. Now, once we get our schedules, some airlines are different, but we'll say around 10% of the flying, has to be dumped into open time. Now, a lot of those trips are because of people's have vacation, so they can't be awarded those trips, or they have training, so that trip comes off their schedule. But in any case, you have, let's say, 10% of the flying in what's called open time. And open time is great because I could take trips that I have that I don't like. For example, I have a trip that starts and ends out of LaGuardia. I'd much prefer a trip out of Newark. So I could put in a request. If I see a trip in open time that starts out of Newark and has the same footprint, I could just swap it. And what's really cool is we have what's called criteria trades. So if there's not a trip that's actually in open time, I could put in a criteria trade that says, hey, if a trip happens to open up during this date, let's say, 10th, 11th, 12th, that's a 3-day that starts and ends in Newark, I want to swap it for my 3-day trip that's in and out of LaGuardia. And if that trip goes into open time, I'll be able to swap out of it as long as nobody senior to me wants that trip. And we have the ability to trade we'll call it every 4 hours. In the morning, we've got a couple opportunities, one at 7, 9, and 11, but then after that, it's every 4 hours. And it's great because, one person drops a trip and it's like a domino effect and creates all of these different trips being dropped or swapped because everybody wants different things. So someone that commutes in, they're not going to want a day trip or a 2-day. Where me, that's perfect. I live locally. I'd much rather do a day trip or a 2-day versus a 4-day trip. And that's really kind of where all the magic happens is once you get your schedule awarded, you put in your preferences, and every 4 hours it's going to run. And it's kind of nice. You wake up to an alert on your phone that says, hey, this trip was dropped or swapped or whatever. Now, again, seniority matters a lot because it's all the trip trades are done via seniority. And the bidding's done via seniority. So you get, if you're super senior, you're not only going to get all the great trips awarded to you in PBS, but you're also going to have the ability to be the first one to pick up or swap a trip in open time. That's kind of just the way the seniority system works. But it's great because all month long, you can swap in and out of trips up until, we'll say, 24 hours prior. And now if you're like me and you don't really want to work all that much, if they have reserve coverage, and I'll talk about reserve in a second, you can just completely drop the trip. Now, you're going to lose the pay for it, but sometimes you'd rather just kind of have the days off. Now, on the other side of that, if you like to hustle and work a lot and you get awarded, my line value for November was around 75 hours with 17 or 18 days off, I could pick up, if I see a 2-day trip worth 10 hours, I could pick up that 2-day trip, and now I'm at 85 hours. And you can do that up until, you can't block more than 100, but you can certainly credit well into the 120, 30, whatever it is, because there's a lot of soft time. What soft time is, if you have a trip with a deadhead, you get paid for the credit of the deadhead where you're sitting in the back, but that doesn't count towards the FAA flight time, actual flight time. So there's ways to make what's called soft time and kind of really add to your pay. Now, again, the narrow body fleets, the 737, the A320 have just a ton of open time. When you get into the wide body fleets like the 787 and the 777, there's not so much open time because they only go to a few destinations and there's just not that much flying compared to the workhorses of, say, the 737. So that becomes a very, very senior position is, a wide body pilot, specifically wide body reserve pilot. Now, when you hear me say the term reserve, what does that mean? You could still bid for the type of reserve that you want. There's like short call and long call reserve where you need, I think it's either 16 or 18 hours before you have to be at the airport. So you've got plenty of time, even if you want to commute in. And there's something called voluntary early check-in where you get a little bit of extra money because you're willing to report to the airport prior to 10 a.m. on day one. This is kind of out of the scope of the conversation, but the point is for reserve, you can bid for kind of what type of reserve you want, or in some airlines, your call-out period. So at United, all start off at long call, but back at Spirit, we had different what's called RAPs, reserve availability period. We had a 0300, which is 3 a.m., and then we had 7 a.m., 11 a.m., so on and so forth, and you could bid for those. But when I bid reserve, I usually just bid for days off. And when you do get reserve, there are ways to kind of move the days around, but it becomes much, much harder, a little bit more complicated than if you were to have a line. But there is the possibility that you could trade reserve days. And what reserve is, again, you're getting paid 75 hours and you're on call for those days. And if they don't use you, you're still getting paid. And if you do get called, you're getting paid per diem. But, they've already kind of paid you for the day, so you don't really get ad pay unless something happens and you get rolled into a day off, so on and so forth. Now, reserve is a good deal if you live locally because you can pick up what's called short calls where it's like, hey, I'm on, a 3-hour call out if you live locally. Or if you don't want to be bothered or you want plenty of time because you have stuff going on at home, you could just stay on long call where you have that 16 or 18 hours, or some airlines may have 24 hours, whatever it is. Now, reserve is nice because if you don't fly for the whole month, you're still getting paid. And usually, like a bad month of reserve, you're going to fly or block maybe 50, 60 hours, but you're still getting paid 75 or 72, whatever the airline has. So it's kind of a good deal. Now, some people get, I don't want to say abused on reserve, but reserve, it's kind of hit or miss. It's very hard to figure out the best way to avoid work. But usually you're going to fly less than you would if you were a line holder. But again, you don't know your schedule. You know the days that you're on, but you don't know where you're going, who you're flying with. And when the weather rolls through in Newark in June, July, August during the summer, and everything starts falling apart, you might as well pack your bag because there's a good chance that you're going to get used. Where in the slower months, reserve goes a little bit more senior because there's not much else going on. because there's not much else going on. So you're going to get paid 75 hours and you're going to fly maybe a 2-day trip or a day trip here or there, and that's really it. So again, just kind of different strokes for different folks. But some people hate reserve. Some people like it. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with reserve. When you don't get called, it's great. But when you think you're not going to get called and the phone rings, you're like, ugh, and then you end up getting either the world's most horrendous trip, or they're like, hey, we have an Orlando turn for you tomorrow, or something really, really simple. So it's not a bad deal. And what we have at our airline, which is great, it's called aggressive pickup. If I have 4 days of reserve, I could pick up a 4-day for tomorrow, or I could pick up a 3-day. So you could pick up a trip that's essentially your reserve footprint -1. So it's kind of a good way to control your own destiny. You can just roll the dice and see if you get called, or if you have a trip that looks pretty good, you can put in a request and pick it up. And even that is done via seniority on reserve. But it's a really, really good system. Reserve here is significantly better than what I'm used to at both Spirit, ExpressJet, and Colgan way back when. Let's see if I missed anything. That's pretty much it. Now, some airlines like Southwest, UPS, and FedEx, I believe, are still line bidding. Some people years ago would think that PBS was the absolute devil and it was just the worst thing in the world because it was more efficient for the airline. But really what it comes down to are your work rules and how you get your work rules. It's a negotiated contract for union airlines, obviously, which UPS, FedEx, and Southwest is. UPS has their own union as well as Southwest, and FedEx is ALPA, much like United and Delta and maybe soon American. But the point is, PBS is just a way for you to bid for your schedule. Your work rules are what's going to make your schedule good or your quality of life good. It has nothing to do with PBS because PBS is only going to build your schedule via the work rules that you've negotiated with your airline. So I much prefer PBS over line bidding. I've done both. I think PBS is the way to go. I know some airlines like Southwest, they like line bidding, and the reason why they might prefer line bidding is because if you have a vacation week and you have, you could see the lines, right? And if you bid for a line where a 4-day trip ends on your first day of vacation, and then a 4-day trip starts on the first day, or excuse me, the last day of your vacation, those 2 trips are going to drop, and you're going to get paid for everything. And remember, those 4-day trips probably have 3 days off on either side. So you have 3 days off, another 4 days off, and then your vacation, and then those other 3 days off because the first day of the 4-day touch your vacation, and then a couple days off after that. So I might be confusing you, but essentially 1 week of vacation can turn into almost a month off, and that is one advantage of line bidding, where PBS is obviously not going to award you a trip that touches your vacation. So to me, that's really the only advantage. And I know back at Spirit, the gentleman that used to actually build the lines was like #1 in base. So he would build lines where a trip would start at the end of the month and then touch a trip at the beginning of the month. And that trip at the beginning of the month would drop and he'd be pay protected. So you kind of just build the lines that way, knowing that you could do that every single month. So you could see why the airline would not want that, rightfully so. But to me, those are the only real advantages of line bidding, and maybe the not having to understand how PBS works. But the union does a great job of putting out videos. I mean, it's a learning curve for me because I'm used to Spirit's PBS software. This software is a little bit more complex. You could do more, but I feel like it's just a little. There's a learning curve. I'll just say that. But it's great because, like I said, someone junior like me, I don't care what trips I do. All I really care about are the days off, and then I'll figure out the rest later. So there it is. For anybody that wonders what route I fly, again, it changes day to day up until almost 24 hours prior to a trip. So there's a lot of different ways to manipulate your schedule, line bidding, PBS, whatever it is. But airline pilots have a kind of a unique ability to move their schedule pretty much more than any other, I'd imagine, professional out there, unless obviously you work for yourself. Any topic I didn't discuss or confused, let me know. Just put a comment down below and I'll do my best to answer it. All right, thanks, guys.